After describing the descent of the Watchers and the rise of the Nephilim, the Book of Enoch shifts its tone dramatically. The narrative moves from rebellion to accountability. What began on Mount Hermon does not remain unresolved. The story advances toward judgment. In Enoch's vision, the archangels observe the growing imbalance on earth. Violence increases. Humanity suffers. The consequences of accelerated knowledge ripple outward. The Watchers, once observers, are now portrayed as responsible actors facing examination. The imagery becomes solemn rather than chaotic. Thrones appear. Decisions are rendered. The language emphasizes order and structure. Judgment is not depicted as random fury, but as deliberate correction. Picture a vast cosmic courtroom rather than a battlefield. Light replaces shadow. Books are opened. Deeds are reviewed. The narrative frames justice as measured and purposeful. This shift reinforces the moral architecture of the entire manuscript. The Watchers are accused not merely of descending, but of overstepping their appointed boundaries. In ancient Jewish thought, cosmic order depended on distinct roles. Heaven and earth operated within assigned domains. Crossing those domains without authorization represented disorder. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers being bound and confined, awaiting further judgment. This imagery symbolizes limitation placed upon unrestrained influence. Power that expanded beyond control is now restricted. For modern American readers, the significance of this scene lies in its structure. The narrative does not glorify rebellion. It insists that misuse of authority leads to consequence. The earlier oath on Mount Hermon introduced acceleration. The judgment introduces accountability. Rather than presenting a spectacle of destruction, Enoch portrays restoration through containment. The Watcher's confinement represents a return to order after imbalance disrupted creation. The tone remains serious but restrained. There are no exaggerated monsters or theatrical chaos. The emphasis is ethical. Actions carry weight. Authority carries responsibility. The binding of the Watchers carries layered meaning within ancient apocalyptic thought. In Jewish tradition, imprisonment imagery often symbolized delayed judgment. Confinement indicated that authority was no longer active. The destabilizing force had been contained. The Book of Enoch describes specific leaders among the Watchers, including Azazel, being separated and restrained. This detail reinforces the theme of accountability at the level of leadership. Those who introduced imbalance are not anonymous. Responsibility is personal. Visualize chains not as literal metal links, but as narrative symbols of restriction. Influence once exercised freely is now limited. Power once projected outward is redirected inward under scrutiny. The text portrays this confinement as preparation for a future reckoning. The idea of waiting judgment reflects ancient legal concepts. Sentencing follows investigation. The cosmic courtroom remains structured. Importantly, this section of Enoch does not celebrate suffering. It emphasizes justice. The narrative presents judgment as necessary to restore equilibrium rather than to entertain readers with dramatic imagery. In the broader arc of the manuscript, this scene balances the earlier rebellion. The oath on Mount Hermon demonstrated collective defiance. The binding demonstrates structured response. For American audiences today, the symbolism resonates in familiar ways. Systems that allow unchecked authority eventually require correction. Institutions that lose balance must be recalibrated. The judgment of the Watchers reflects that principle through apocalyptic language. It preserves the idea that power misused does not remain unaddressed. The enduring strength of this passage lies in its moral clarity. It affirms that boundaries exist for a reason, and crossing them carries consequence. As the judgment scene progresses, the Book of Enoch introduces a striking contrast between rebellion and structure. The same cosmic order that allowed the Watchers to observe humanity now enforces accountability. Authority is not chaotic. It is hierarchical and deliberate. The text describes the archangel Raphael binding Azazel in a desolate place, covering him in darkness until the final judgment. This imagery reflects ancient symbolism. Wilderness represented isolation. Darkness represented removal from influence. The language communicates restriction rather than spectacle. Imagine a powerful leader suddenly stripped of platform and voice. Influence that once shaped communities is confined. The narrative frames this moment not as revenge, but as containment. Enoch emphasizes that the corruption introduced by the Watchers had tangible effects on humanity. Violence spread, knowledge distorted, systems destabilized. The judgment therefore addresses systemic imbalance rather than isolated missteps. The story underscores personal responsibility. Each Watcher faces consequence for crossing boundaries assigned within the cosmic order. Ancient Jewish cosmology held that harmony depended on roles being respected. Disorder emerged when those roles were violated. Scholars often note that apocalyptic literature uses vivid imagery to convey moral truth rather than scientific mechanics. The binding of the Watchers should be read within that framework. It communicates that unchecked authority cannot operate indefinitely. For American readers, this passage feels surprisingly contemporary. When leaders misuse power, institutional correction becomes necessary. Oversight mechanisms exist to preserve balance. Enoch expresses that concept through cosmic language. The emphasis on structured judgment reinforces the ethical spine of the manuscript. The rebellion at Mount Hermon triggered a cascade. The binding scene represents interruption of that cascade. Power misused is restrained. Influence destabilizing creation is limited. Order begins to reassert itself. Another important dimension of this judgment narrative is its theological purpose. The Book of Enoch was written for communities seeking reassurance during unstable times. Foreign empires dominated Judea. Political authority often felt unjust. Within that context, the judgment of the Watchers offered hope. If even heavenly beings faced accountability, then earthly tyrants were not beyond scrutiny. The cosmic courtroom symbolized ultimate justice. The narrative structure moves from observation to rebellion to consequence. This arc reinforces the belief that no authority operates permanently without evaluation. The Watcher's confinement anticipates final resolution rather than leaving corruption unresolved. The imagery of chains and darkness has influenced later theological thought, including passages in the New Testament that reference angels kept in chains until judgment. This continuity demonstrates how Enoch's themes shaped broader religious imagination. Importantly, the text avoids excessive focus on suffering. The attention remains on restored balance. Justice is corrective, not sensational. For modern audiences, the lesson extends beyond ancient cosmology. Systems that lack accountability deteriorate. Power that escapes oversight destabilizes communities. Correction may be delayed, but it arrives. The judgment of the Watchers therefore becomes a narrative affirmation that imbalance does not define the final chapter. The earlier acceleration of knowledge created disruption. The binding scene introduces restraint. This structural symmetry gives the Book of Enoch coherence. It moves from rebellion to resolution without glorifying either extreme. The passage stands as a reminder that authority carries weight, and that crossing defined boundaries reshapes the system in lasting ways. As the Book of Enoch moves toward its conclusion, the judgment of the Watchers takes on broader symbolic weight. The binding is not merely punishment for individual rebellion. It represents restoration of cosmic order after systemic disruption. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes that the corruption introduced by the Watchers distorted both humanity and creation itself. Violence was not isolated. It became cultural. Knowledge was not neutral. It was weaponized. The judgment addresses the scale of that impact. In ancient Jewish theology, order was sacred. Creation functioned within divinely established boundaries. When those boundaries were crossed, imbalance followed. The Watcher's confinement signals that disorder cannot remain permanent. Picture the shift from chaos to containment. The same mountain that witnessed an oath of rebellion now stands as silent testimony to consequence. The narrative symmetry is deliberate. This section also underscores patience within divine justice. The Watchers are bound until the day of judgment. The delay reflects ancient legal patterns. Investigation precedes final sentence. Time allows for reckoning. For communities reading Enoch during periods of foreign domination, this imagery offered reassurance. If heavenly beings were not exempt from accountability, neither were oppressive earthly powers. Justice might not be immediate, but it was inevitable. The judgment narrative therefore functions as theological encouragement. It affirms that corruption does not define the ultimate structure of reality. Order persists beneath disruption. Modern readers can approach this passage without sensationalism. The binding scene does not demand belief in literal chains. It invites reflection on restraint placed upon destabilizing influence. The enduring message remains consistent. Power misused invites limitation. Authority exercised without responsibility eventually faces correction. Stepping back from the entire arc of the Watcher's story, the judgment scene completes a carefully constructed narrative. The oath on Mount Hermon introduced deliberate rebellion. The spread of knowledge intensified imbalance. The rise of the Nephilim magnified disruption. The flood represented reset. The binding marked accountability. This progression reveals the manuscript's deeper intention. The Book of Enoch is not a collection of random supernatural episodes. It is a moral architecture describing the consequences of crossing established boundaries. The judgment of the Watchers anchors that architecture. It ensures that rebellion does not stand unchallenged. It reinforces that cosmic order includes mechanisms for correction. For American audiences today, the relevance lies not in searching for hidden prisons beneath the earth, but in recognizing the principle embedded within the imagery. Systems require oversight. Authority requires restraint. Knowledge requires wisdom. The narrative does not celebrate destruction. It affirms balance. It does not sensationalize punishment. It emphasizes restoration. That restraint is precisely what makes the story endure. Ancient apocalyptic language may sound dramatic, but its core message is steady and grounded. Power must align with purpose. Influence must respect limits. The judgment of the Watchers closes one of the most compelling sections of the Book of Enoch by affirming that no authority operates outside accountability. And that is why this ancient text continues to resonate across centuries, not because it promises secret revelations, but because it preserves a timeless pattern of responsibility and consequence.